If I had to describe GCF in one word, it would be caring.
Authentic.
Family. Community.
GCF in one word, family.
Fun.
Belonging.
Community.
Gracious.
Resurrection.
Family.
GCF is the best family. GCF to me is home.
But I want us to think just a little bit, since we're still at the beginning of a new year and only on January 5th, to think a little bit about 2020 this morning. So if you have a Bible, you can find Philippians chapter 1, right around verse 12. Going to look at some things that Paul wrote in that chapter. I think that some of the most moving writing of the last century was actually not written by some of the great novelists like Hemingway and Steinbeck and others. I think some of the most moving writing of the last century actually was written by unknown men and women who lived during the period of World War II and whose lives were affected by World War II. For example, the letters that men on the European front and then in the Pacific would write back to their wives or their sweethearts or their fiancés here in the United States, and the letters that those women, those sweethearts and fiancés and wives would then write back to their men who were over fighting on one of the two fronts are just absolutely beautiful. And back in 2015, the Washington Post printed a series of letters that had been sent from a fellow named Frank Elliott to his wife, whose name was Pauline. They had a young daughter. He called her Polly, and some letters that Polly had written back to Frank. And I just want to read one of Frank's letters to you this morning, and then share a bit of one of Polly's replies to Frank. The first letter he wrote about 1 month. He was stationed in England, and he wrote this letter about 1 month before D-Day, the official invasion of continental Europe. He wrote, "Well, sweetheart, don't worry, please. It is possible I may be a member in the assault, but no more possible than that I may someday die. I don't hold with the theory of the inevitable school, and so you may be sure that I won't invite disaster in any form. In prep school, we had a quarterback who always qualified his pregame prayers with the phrase, 'Not my will, God, but thine.' And so it is, sweetheart, and so it must always be. We must trust God unflinchingly, unquestioningly. I love them all, but Polly I love best of all. Frank." Then she wrote this letter to Frank on June 5th, 1944. "This is a beautiful summer evening, darling. Looking at the kitchen window, I can gaze upon a truly silvery full moon. I'd begun to think that I was immune to the moon's enchantment. So often I have looked at it without you and to keep myself from going mad, told myself it's pretty, yes, but so what? That's not the way it is, though, darling. The sight of that shining moon up there, the moon shines on you, too. And even though it's just a dream now, it's a promise of a glorious future with one I love more than life. That darned old moon keeps shining for us, darling. And even as it increases that inescapable loneliness, it also increases my confidence in the future. I love you truly, Polly." That letter never arrived to Frank because Frank died the next day, the day after that letter was written, invading Normandy, and the letter was returned several weeks later along with Frank's body and along with his belongings to Polly, and that longing for each other. And I think the longing that's reflected in Frank's letters to Polly and Polly's letters to Frank actually is reflected in a letter that Paul wrote to a church in a little city called Philippi. Paul was especially important to the members of this little church in Philippi because he was their spiritual father. He had led the first members of that church to Jesus. He had started that church. He had almost a bit of an infatuation with the Christians in Philippi. And the Christians in Philippi loved Paul dearly because he was their spiritual father. And they were in a place where, just as Polly longed for letters from Frank and Frank longed for letters from Polly, the Philippians were longing to receive a letter from Paul. They wanted to know how Paul was doing, and they had some reason to be worried about Paul. They knew that Paul was imprisoned. They knew that he was being held in prison in Rome, that he was being held in prison by the Praetorian Guard. Those were like elite Roman forces. They knew that when you were in prison in a place like Rome, that that the prison, it wasn't the government's responsibility to feed you. People had to bring you food to supply for you. And if they didn't, you just didn't eat. You might starve to death in prison. They knew that there was some ruckus that had been created around Paul's arrival in Rome, that some members of the church in Rome had really accepted Paul, and some members of the church were not so keen on Paul and were creating some issues for him. And in the midst of being in prison and having this sort of ruckus starting in church and wondering if he's starving to death, if anybody's feeding him because the Christians are all divided over him, they were also concerned about Paul's emotional well-being. Like, how is Paul holding up inside of himself? And not just his emotional well-being, they would have been wondering about his spiritual well-being. Is our spiritual father still in the faith? Is he still hanging on? Is he still following after Jesus? And so Paul finally has an opportunity to write them this letter, and the letter makes its way to Philippi through some of Paul's messengers. And when the letter gets to Philippi, they would have all gathered around in the church together. The focus of that gathering would have been to read Paul's letter. Paul never wrote very short letters, so it would have taken a while to read his letters, but everybody wanted to know what was going on with Paul. And so Paul starts out by offering them a greeting, he offers them a blessing, and then he sort of dives immediately into these things he knows the Philippians are worried about. And so he does verify for them that he is imprisoned, that he's being held in prison, and that because he was trying to share the gospel, he verifies for them he verifies for them that there was a mixed response from the Roman Christians. He says, it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry. In other words, what he meant was that while he's in prison, there are other members in the church, other leaders in the church who are trying to become the key leader in the church, to take Paul's place, to overcome him, to subdue him in his leadership role. And they're maybe doing it by doing somewhat of trash talking. So he says, it's true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. So he says that both of those things are going on in the church there. And then he finally tells them how he's holding up spiritually and emotionally. By the way, they would have been hoping that some of those who were preaching the gospel out of goodwill, they would have been hoping that those folks were providing Paul with food in prison and were being brave enough to take care of him. And finally, he tells them how he's let me get to this. This is what he says is going on. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. Those are the people who are goodwill. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. So he verifies that he's in prison. He verifies that some people are preaching the gospel in Rome for the right reasons. Some are preaching it for the wrong reasons. Then he tells them how he's doing emotionally and spiritually. And because of this, I rejoice. I mean, that's pretty doggone astounding. He's being held in prison where the government has no real responsibility to feed him or take care of him. Dark, dingy cells, most likely. He's got some people who are encouraging other people not to feed him and not to take care of him. People who are trying to supplant his role in the church, who are trash talking him and trying to undo him. He's got a few other people of goodwill who are doing the right thing and who favor him and who love him for what he's doing. And in the midst of all of this, Paul says to the Philippian Christians, if I could describe my emotional and spiritual state to you, I would describe it this way. Because of all of this, I rejoice. Now, how in the world can that be? How can you rejoice when you are in a situation like that? I mean, most of us have trouble rejoicing if we spill our coffee. So how in the world can Paul rejoice when he's in a situation like that? Well, Paul is going to begin explaining to them how it is, a couple of reasons that it is that he can have an attitude of rejoicing in the midst of everything that's going on with him. And so he says this, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. Paul says the reason I'm rejoicing is that because even though things look pretty bad for me, the stuff that's happened to me is causing the gospel to go forward. Well, what is the gospel? It's not the 4 spiritual laws. It's not the Romans road. The gospel is the story of the life, death, resurrection, ascension, and return of Jesus. That's the gospel. And Paul says, I'm rejoicing because the gospel is advancing. More and more people are hearing about Jesus. More and more people are coming to faith in Jesus because of what's happened to me. Now, how could that possibly be the case? How could he be in prison and the gospel be advancing? Well, Paul says, first of all, well, you can imagine this. He says, first of all, the guards who are watching over me, hearing a lot about Jesus. Because he's talking about it. He's telling them about Jesus. The life, the death, the resurrection, the ascension, the return of Jesus. He's talking about that with the guards in prison. Then he says this, and because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel, the story of Jesus without fear. In other words, because they see him in prison, the Christians who are not in prison are becoming more bold in sharing the story of Jesus. They're being encouraged that they can suffer the consequences of sharing the gospel as well. So there are more people sharing the gospel. Well, what about those people who are sharing the gospel out of false motives? The people who are sharing the gospel who are trying to do it to get Paul out of his place of leadership in the church and doing it by way of also trash-talking Paul. Paul says this, but what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Paul says, look, I really don't care if they're preaching Jesus because they want people to know about Jesus or if they're preaching Jesus because they want to make me look bad or make themselves look better than me. The gospel is being preached. The story of Jesus is being told. And people are believing that story. And Paul says, that's why I rejoice. And see, this gospel, the telling of the story of Jesus, the advancement of the story of Jesus is the cause that Paul lives for. Paul lives for the telling of the story of Jesus so that others can come to faith and experience life in the kingdom of God through Jesus. That is the cause that his life is wrapped around. And that cause is so important to Paul that he is even willing to go to jail for it. He is even willing to die for it. Paul has a cause. His cause is the gospel, the story of Jesus, and telling it so that others can come to life in the kingdom of God through Jesus. And then Paul's going to go on and explain a little bit more about why he's actually in a rejoicing kind of mood while he's in the midst of all of these terrible circumstances. He says this, yes, and I will continue to rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. So Paul is hoping on one hand that he's going to get out of prison. But for Paul, being delivered from present circumstances doesn't just mean he's going to get out of prison. For Paul, being delivered from his present circumstances also means that he might die. So this is what he says next. I am torn between the two. In other words, I'm torn between getting out of prison to tell more people about Jesus or dying and going to be with Jesus. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Paul has a cause. It's a cause he's willing to die for. And so long as he's alive, it's a cause he will live for. Then he tells them that he's doing okay with his faith. He says this, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed. Because I'm hoping that in the midst of my circumstances, I will do nothing that is faithless. That I will do nothing of which I could be ashamed or of which you could be ashamed of me. But will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. And you see, Paul has a cause. His cause is the story of Jesus so that people can come to life in the kingdom of God through Jesus. And that is a cause that if he dies, he will die for it. And if he lives, he will live for it. He has a cause. Then he just sums it up really succinctly. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. In other words, if my deliverance is getting out of this prison, I'm living for Jesus. I'm living to tell the story. I'm living to bring other people into the kingdom. It's what I will keep doing, even if it means I end up back in prison. It's what I will keep doing. And if I die in this place, should I end up being crucified as Jesus was crucified? If I die, that's not so bad. I'm going to go be with the one I've been telling everybody about. See the way Paul has a cause. It's the story of Jesus, bringing people to life in the kingdom. Jesus is his cause. So if he lives, he'll live for Jesus. If he dies, he'll go to be with Jesus. Whether he lives or dies, he's aiming for Jesus. Jesus, the gospel, that's his cause. And he says, if I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. In other words, if Paul goes on living, he's going to keep planting churches. He's going to keep telling people about Jesus. He will keep doing what is fruitful for the kingdom of God because that is the cause. And because Paul has a cause worth dying for, Paul finds that his life, so long as he is alive, is a life worth living. It's an important lesson for us as we think about moving into 2020. Life is worth living when you have a cause worth dying for. Life is worth living when you have a cause worth dying for. If you do not have a cause that you find worthy of the sacrifice of your own life, you have nothing to live for. It is having a cause that you find worthy of the sacrifice of your life and everything that you are that gives meaning to every day that you live. One of the key distinctions between World War II and Vietnam, though they were only 25 years apart, was this sense that one of those wars wasn't a cause worth dying for, and that one of them was a cause worth dying for. So we know that most of the men who died in Vietnam were drafted into that conflict. We know that most of them went because they felt that it was their duty to be obedient to the draft, but they never quite understood why they were there, why they were doing what they were doing. And people here back home, their loved ones had trouble understanding why they were doing what they were doing and why the government was asking them to do that. But World War II is so strikingly different. There was the draft during World War II, but did you know that the overwhelming majority of men who fought in World War II did not have to be drafted? They went to sign up. They went to volunteer. My granddad went to volunteer the day after Pearl Harbor with his cousin for the Navy. I think 85-90% of them were volunteer. They went because there was something about what was happening in World War II that people thought was a cause worth fighting for. I think it's so well illustrated in one of Frank Elliott's, I read their letters earlier, in one of the letters he wrote to his wife Polly. This is, again, just a few weeks before D-Day. Darn it, darling. I would certainly like to be on hand when Dee, that's the little girl, goes to see her first movie. Take her to Youngstown, Pittsburgh, or Cleveland, to one of those theaters with a long, impressive lobby with candy counters and attractive posters. I'll bet she'll love it. Don't postpone her enjoyment till I come home, but let me know how she reacts to all the glamour of Hollywood's productions. Frank. That was Frank's cause worth dying for. Like so many of the men who went to fight in World War II, Frank believed that if he did not go to fight fascism, if he did not go to fight the Nazis, if he did not go to fight imperial forces, there would be a world in which his little girl Dee could never go to a fancy movie theater and see what she wanted to see and have smiles on her face because of the glossy posters and the full candy counter and all the ornate trim that they used to put in old movie theaters. That was his cause worth dying for. And because he had a cause worth dying for, Frank knew how to direct his life. He had to volunteer. He had to go fight. He had to spend his life that way because he had a cause worth dying for. Life is worth living when you have a cause worth dying for. When you don't have a cause worth dying for, do you know what you do when you wake up in the morning? More often than not, you'll hit the snooze button 10 or 15 times or until your phone won't let you hit it anymore. You don't have a real sense of why you're waking up. But if you have a cause worth dying for, you might occasionally hit the snooze button once or twice. But that's only because you've set it a few minutes early so you can get up and get after the cause that's worth dying for. Changes things. Cause worth dying for makes your life worth living. You live it differently when you have a cause worth dying for. Your to-do list, the things that are on your mind to have to be done. If you don't have a cause worth dying for, you get up and your to-do list is just a bunch of wonky stuff you have to get through to survive the day. But if you have a cause worth dying for, your to-do list becomes focused on the things that give life to people, that are focused on the cause that's worth dying for. And you are excited and you anticipate many of the things that are on your to-do list. Going to bed at night, if you don't have a cause worth dying for, you go to bed feeling like the day you just lived was a humongous waste of time, and you're certainly convinced that tomorrow will not bring anything much different. But if you have a cause worth dying for, you go to bed counting the ways you lived for that call and counting the ways that you will live for it tomorrow, anticipating what is yet to come. Life is worth living when you have a cause worth dying for. So what is your cause for 2020? What is the cause that is worth dying for in this new year that we're facing, that we're slightly in and still facing? What is the cause that's worth dying for? What is the cause that's worth dying for that will make your life worth living every day? Now, just a disclaimer, for those of you who may not be regular churchgoers or may not be followers of Jesus, as you probably have figured out, I'm a pastor and a follower of Jesus, so, I just happen to believe that the one greatest cause worth dying for is Jesus. And telling the story of Jesus. Leading people into life in the kingdom of God. But if you're not a follower of Jesus, here's the thing about this. This will work in your life too. If you're not a follower of Jesus, this will work. Because even if you're not a follower of Jesus, the key to having a life that is more worth living is actually having a cause that's worth dying for. So even if you're not a follower of Jesus, you can find something to give your life to, something that brings meaning to your life, something that you would stake a lot of yourself for. There's lots of problems in the world. There's race issues. There's sex trafficking. There's messed up kids. There's broken marriages. You can think of a number of things that don't require you to be a faith-based person that you can give your life to find a cause worth dying for that will give more meaning to your life. But most of us here are followers of Jesus. And I just happen to believe if we're followers of Jesus, the one cause greater than any other cause in our life that we find worth dying for is telling the story. It's telling the story of Jesus so that people can come to life in the kingdom of God through Jesus. And so just a question. If your cause is not Jesus, but you've got another cause that you think is worth dying for, how does that cause need to shape the way you live every day this year? And if you are a follower of Jesus and you agree with me that the gospel telling the story of Jesus is the cause worth dying for, how does that cause need to shape the way you live every day in 2020? It could be as simple as praying with your neighbors when you know they're in trouble. It could be as simple as telling someone at work about why you follow Jesus. It could be as simple as starting to pray once a week with your spouse or a friend. If the gospel is the cause that is worth dying for you in 2020, how will it shape every day that you live in 2020? So I want to give us just a minute for you to think about what that cause is. If you're a follower of Jesus, I want to give you just a few minutes to listen to what Jesus is telling you about the cause he wants you to die for.